It began with a signal faint at first, then unmistakable. Something vast moved beyond Neptune's orbit, hidden in the darkness between stars. It was not a natural phenomenon, it was a fleet. For centuries, humanity had expanded peacefully, settling Mars, Europa, and Titan. War had become a distant memory, buried beneath the progress of a united Earth. But the universe is not kind to the peaceful. The Vashtari learned of Earth's wealth and technology, and they did what conquerors have always done. They came to take. They believed humans were weak, unprepared, incapable of resistance. What they didn't know was that Earth had not forgotten war. We had only hidden it, and now we would teach them what it meant to wake a species that had once mastered destruction. The Vashtari fleet approached the outer edges of the solar system with the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. Their warships, towering constructs of black metal and pulsing energy, moved in perfect formation. To them, this was just another conquest, one more primitive world to subjugate, one more civilization to erase or enslave. They had done this 100 times before. Humanity would be no different. Their intelligence reports described Earth as technologically advanced but peaceful, a species that had abandoned war, unified under a single global order, dedicated to exploration and scientific progress. The Vashtari mistook peace for weakness. They believed humanity had forgotten how to fight. They sent their warning first, a standard ultimatum broadcast across all frequencies. The message was simple: surrender and become subjects of the Vashtari Empire, or resist and face extinction. There was no immediate response. Not a single human transmission acknowledged their presence. It was as if the fleet had spoken into a void. It was the first sign that something was wrong. As the Vashtari armada moved past Neptune, the first ship disappeared. No explosion, no distress signal, just a sudden loss of contact. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. Confused but not yet alarmed, the Vashtari commanders assumed a malfunction, perhaps an error in their fleet formation. Then, a second ship vanished. This time, the vessel's automated system sent a brief pulse of data before it was lost. A rapid drop in temperature, external pressure spikes, and then nothing. The Vashtari fleet slowed its advance. Warships adjusted their positions, scanning the darkness. Their instruments found no enemy ships, no signs of an attack. Space itself remained calm and undisturbed. Yet something was here. Something that could reach out from the void and erase entire vessels without leaving a trace. The panic began when the third and fourth ships vanished simultaneously. Commanders shouted over encrypted channels, demanding explanations, but there were none. Every attempt to track their missing vessels led only to empty space. Sensors picked up nothing. The Vashtari were an empire of warriors, trained for battle against fleets and armies, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to be seen. They changed tactics, spreading their formation to avoid further losses. Fighters were launched, scanning drones deployed. For a brief moment they believed they had regained control, but then the attacks resumed. This time, it was not just disappearances. Ships exploded from within, their reactors detonating as if they had been sabotaged. Others lost power, their systems shutting down one by one, leaving them adrift. A fleet of thousands had arrived at the edge of the solar system. By the time the Vashtari realized what was happening, only a fraction remained. Earth had not responded to their warning. Something far deadlier had. The Vashtari had always believed victory belonged to those with the largest fleets, the strongest weapons, and the most hardened soldiers. Their empire had expanded under this philosophy, crushing civilizations that dared to resist. Their warships, massive and bristling with firepower, were symbols of their dominance. They believed that power was measured in raw strength, in the number of ships one could deploy. But Earth had learned a different lesson from its history. Power was not about the size of an army. It was about control, precision, and the ability to strike without being seen. For centuries, humanity had presented itself as peaceful, its military presence appearing almost non-existent. There were no vast orbital shipyards producing massive war fleets, no grand displays of military power. To any outside observer, Earth seemed focused on science and exploration. But this was not naivete. It was deception. War had not been forgotten. It had been studied, refined, and made into something surgical, something invisible. The Vashtari fleet, which had once stretched for thousands of kilometers in perfect formation, was now fractured, desperately searching for an enemy it could not see. Their sensors, built to detect the energy signatures of traditional warships, found nothing. Their weapons, designed to fight in direct engagements, had no targets. Humanity's warships did not engage in open combat. They had been built in secret, hidden within the asteroid belt, concealed beneath the icy crust of Europa, buried in the rings of Saturn. Each vessel was unlike anything the Vashtari had encountered. Their hulls absorbed scans instead of reflecting them. Their weapon systems did not emit predictable energy signatures. They were ghosts in the dark. When humanity struck, it did so with precision. One Vashtari battleship, an enormous dreadnought capable of leveling entire cities, suffered a catastrophic failure in its core reactor. It had not been hit by a missile or a laser. Instead, a microscopic drone, no larger than a grain of sand, had infiltrated its systems, rewriting its software, forcing it to overload its own power grid. Within seconds, the ship tore itself apart from within. Another Vashtari vessel found itself helpless as every electronic system went dark. Its engines failed, its weapons shut down, and its crew could do nothing but watch as an unseen force hijacked their navigation, sending them drifting into deep space forever lost. The Vashtari were accustomed to war as spectacle, where battles were fought in grand, brutal engagements. Humanity had no need for such displays. The war had already been won before the first Vashtari ship arrived. As the remnants of the Vashtari fleet scrambled to retreat, a final message reached them not in words, but in silence. Earth did not respond. It did not negotiate. It did not warn. It simply removed its enemies from existence. Panic spread through the Vashtari fleet like a virus. Their warships, once symbols of unstoppable might, had become tombs in waiting. Every system scan yielded nothing. Every attempt to pinpoint an enemy revealed only the vast, unchanging void of space. And yet, ships continued to disappear. The Vashtari commanders demanded answers. How could an entire fleet be dismantled without a single direct engagement? How could warships, built to withstand planetary bombardments, simply vanish? They refused to believe the truth staring them in the face. They were not fighting an enemy they could overpower. They were being hunted. With no targets to engage, the Vashtari turned their weapons on the darkness itself. Entire sectors of space were flooded with energy blasts, missiles, and superheated plasma. They fired blindly, hoping to strike something, anything that would make their enemy reveal itself. But their weapons found only empty space. The enemy was not where they thought it was. The enemy was already inside. Across the remaining fleet, systems began failing. Communication networks flickered, screens turned to static, and targeting systems refused to lock onto anything but their own allies. Conflicting orders spread through the fleet as Vashtari ships, deceived by hacked sensors, turned their weapons on each other. Some commanders, believing they had finally found their attackers, opened fire only to realize too late that they had been tricked. The chaos was not random. It was deliberate, precise. Every failure, every misfire, every lost vessel was part of a strategy. Humanity was not just attacking them, it was dismantling them from the inside, piece by piece. One warship, a battlecruiser at the heart of the formation, suffered a complete oxygen purge. In less than a minute, its entire crew suffocated, their bodies floating weightlessly inside a vessel that remained fully operational. Another ship had its artificial gravity systems reversed, sending its soldiers crashing into the ceiling, breaking bones and rupturing organs before the ship detonated from an internal overload. The Vashtari were no longer fighting a war. They were being erased. It was no longer a battle in the traditional sense. There were no great clashes, no heroic last stands. The Vashtari had entered the solar system with an invasion force meant to crush a civilization. But the civilization they had come to conquer had evolved beyond conventional war. The Vashtari had expected resistance. Instead, they had walked into an execution. Their forces had already been reduced to less than a third of their original numbers. And yet they still had no idea where the attacks were coming from. There were no enemy war cries, no visible fleets, no warnings. Just the silent, methodical dismantling of their empire's might. In desperation, the Vashtari High Commander issued the only order left to give: retreat. Flee to the edges of the system, regroup and reassess. They had arrived expecting to dominate. Now they only hoped to survive. But humanity had already decided. There would be no survivors. The Vashtari fleet, or what little remained of it, limped toward the edge of the solar system. Their invasion had turned into a massacre not of humanity, but of themselves. No battle had been fought in the way they understood. No grand exchange of fire. No dueling warships. No chance to retaliate. Their enemies had remained unseen, striking from the void with surgical precision, unraveling the Vashtari war machine one ship at a time. Now barely a fraction of their fleet remained intact, and even those vessels were compromised. Systems flickered and malfunctioned at random. Engines sputtered, refusing to ignite. Life support struggled to maintain pressure. Some ships drifted in silence, their crews suffocated in their own corridors. This was not war. This was a demonstration. With nowhere left to turn, the Vashtari High Commander made a decision. He sent a transmission, not a threat, not an ultimatum, but a plea. They would surrender. They would withdraw from Earth's system and never return. They would recognize humanity's strength and offer tribute. Anything to stop the destruction. The message was sent. The fleet waited. Earth did not respond. There was no acknowledgement, no transmission, no acceptance of their surrender, only silence. And then something far worse arrived. A single data stream was transmitted to every surviving Vashtari ship. It was not a declaration. It was not a warning. It was something much colder. It was a history lesson. The images appeared on every screen, on every console, forcing the Vashtari to witness Earth's past. They saw the trenches of World War I, where millions had perished in mud and fire. They saw the burning cities of World War II, the mushroom clouds rising into the sky, the instant annihilation of entire populations. They saw battlefields turn to wastelands, the scars of conflicts so destructive that even centuries later, the land remained poisoned. They watched as war machines evolved, from swords and spears to nuclear weapons and orbital bombardments. They witnessed the birth of artificial intelligence created not for peace, but for the sole purpose of war. And then the final image. A Vashtari warship, still intact, still whole, floating helplessly in space. At first, it seemed untouched, but then its hull began to disintegrate, atom by atom, erased by something unseen. Not a weapon of brute force, not an explosion, but something more terrifying, something surgical, precise, unstoppable. The message was clear. Earth did not need peace treaties. It did not require negotiations. There would be no terms, no conditions, no deals. The Vashtari had made a choice when they entered the solar system. Now they would face the consequences. The silence from Earth was not a pause, it was a decision. And the Vashtari finally understood. There would be no surrender. The Vashtari fleet broke. There was no longer any semblance of formation, no chain of command, no strategic withdrawal. It was a desperate flight into the abyss, each warship seeking escape in whatever direction it could. The High Commander's surrender had been met with silence. Their plea for mercy had been ignored. Earth had answered with history, a message more terrifying than any spoken threat. Now, survival was all that mattered. The surviving ships engaged their fastest drives, pushing their engines beyond safety limits. Some burned too hot, rupturing under the strain, their crews roasted alive as containment fields failed. Others accelerated at reckless angles, colliding with debris, breaking apart in flashes of metal and fire. But the greatest horror was that Earth had not stopped. The Vashtari had believed distance would save them, that retreat would be accepted, but Earth did not fight wars for territory or glory. It fought wars to end threats, and a fleet that had come with the intent of planetary conquest could never be allowed to return home. The first warship to fall in the pursuit was a destroyer, its engines flickering before it was dragged backward, as if something unseen had latched onto it. No external force was detected, no beam, no tether. Yet the ship stopped mid-flight, frozen in the void. Then its hull peeled apart, layer by layer, atom by atom. It did not explode, it did not crumple, it simply ceased to be. The Vashtari captains watching from their own ships were unable to comprehend what they had witnessed, but their minds had no time to process the horror, because now it was happening everywhere. Another ship lost all navigation control, its thrusters firing at random, sending it spinning into the gravitational pull of a distant gas giant. The crew's desperate distress calls cut off as the vessel was swallowed by the clouds below. A battleship, one of the fleet's largest and most formidable, suddenly lost all life signs. Not a single blast had touched it, not a single hull breach, yet every living being aboard was gone. The ship itself remained functional, its lights still glowing, its systems still operational, but its corridors were empty. Those who remained knew the truth now. They had never stood a chance. They had expected a war fought with battleships, energy weapons, and strategic formations, but humanity had long since moved beyond such primitive notions. Earth did not send warships to chase them down. It did not waste ammunition on a broken enemy. Instead, it had unleashed something far worse. The Vashtari did not know if it was a machine, an intelligence, or something else entirely. They only knew that it was hunting them, and it was never going to stop. There would be no survivors. Not a single ship would return to Vashtari space. The lesson Earth had chosen to teach would be absolute. Threaten Earth, and you do not face a war. You face extinction. The Vashtari survivors had fled beyond the edges of the solar system, their once mighty fleet now nothing more than scattered wreckage and haunted transmissions. Those who remained knew one truth above all others. They were already dead. The darkness was no longer empty. It had never been. They had come expecting to find a world unprepared for war. Instead, they had awakened something far worse, something that did not forgive, did not negotiate, and did not stop. A single Vashtari cruiser, its hull scarred and engines barely functional, drifted at the edge of the system. Its captain sent one final message toward home, a desperate plea for rescue. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one would come. The transmission was never sent. Something intercepted it. The moment the signal attempted to leave the ship, it vanished. Not jammed, not blocked, erased. The Vashtari had no idea how it had happened. No visible ships, no signs of an enemy presence. Yet it was clear they were not being allowed to call for help. They were being cut off. Another ship, a heavy dreadnought once at the heart of the invasion fleet, had nearly made it to open space. Its crew had begun to believe they might escape, that they could bring word of this nightmare back to their homeworld. Then their engines fired in reverse. Not by their command, not by any mechanical failure. Something else had seized control. The dreadnought turned, not toward freedom, but back toward the solar system. Its crew screamed, desperately trying to override the commands, to shut down power, to do anything to stop the ship's course. Nothing worked. They had lost control. One by one, every remaining Vashtari vessel experienced the same fate. Navigation systems refused to obey. Engines turned against them. Life support flickered, fluctuating between deadly cold and unbearable heat. Gravity plating reversed at random, sending crew crashing into walls, ceilings, or each other. They were not being killed immediately. They were being taken. To where, they did not know. but their trajectories all pointed to the same destination, back to Earth. One vessel attempted a desperate maneuver, igniting its warp drive in a final effort to flee. It succeeded. The ship vanished into the void, only to reappear in the exact same location it had just left. The laws of physics, the fundamental rules of reality were no longer on their side. Whatever humanity had unleashed upon them, it was not a fleet. It was not a weapon. It was not something they could fight. It was something designed to make sure no one ever threatened Earth again. And now it was bringing them back. Not for negotiation, not for surrender, but for judgment. The Vashtari fleet was gone. What remained of it, the ships that had been spared immediate annihilation, were now drifting back toward Earth, not by choice, but by the unseen force that had claimed control over them. They were no longer invaders. They were no longer soldiers. They were captives. No Vashtari had seen their enemy. No shots had been exchanged. The war had never been a battle of weapons or strategy. It had been a demonstration, a reminder to the universe that Earth was not to be threatened. The Vashtari High Commander stood on the shattered bridge of his once mighty warship, staring at the growing blue sphere in the distance. Earth. His empire had conquered hundreds of worlds. Never had they encountered one they could not subjugate. Never had they suffered a loss so total that not a single one of their kind would return home. And yet, here they were. As they were pulled toward Earth's orbit, the surviving Vashtari saw something that should not have been possible. From the void, the darkness itself seemed to shift. Not ships, not visible crafts. Something deeper, something beyond their understanding. A presence. It had been there all along. Watching. Waiting. It was not an artificial intelligence. It was not a fleet of stealth ships. It was something else entirely. Something that had been born from centuries of human warfare, sharpened into the perfect instrument of destruction. A force that did not merely destroy enemies, it erased them. One by one, the Vashtari ships were silenced. Their crews did not scream. They did not die. They simply ceased. No remains, no wreckage, no trace that they had ever existed, until only one ship remained. The High Commander's flagship was the last vessel still intact. Still moving toward Earth's surface, its systems were failing one by one, and its crew had already vanished. He was alone now. Then, for the first time since the invasion began, a message arrived. Not in Vashtari language, not in spoken words, but as a single thought. Clear, undeniable, absolute. We are not conquerors, we are not tyrants, we are not warriors. We are peace. And you threatened it. The High Commander had no time to comprehend the message before his ship disintegrated in perfect silence. No explosion, no debris. Nothing remained. The Vashtari invasion force had come to crush a primitive world. Instead, they had become a warning. Across the galaxy, in the years that followed, rumors spread of a planet that did not fight wars, that had abandoned conquest and destruction, a planet that had no fleets, no armies, no need for violence. And yet no empire dared to challenge it. No fleet ever approached its borders again. For Earth was not defenseless. It was simply waiting. And those who threatened its peace never returned.